Afternoon, everyone. We're just going to let people join before we make a start. Thanks. Okay, so numbers have settled, so we'll make a start. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us for this episode of SIME Sector Streams webinar series. My name is Jason Reeves. I'm SIME's Head of Policy. I'll be hosting today. And today we'll be looking at the Nature Recovery Green Paper and Environmental Targets consultations. For information, previous episodes of the Sector Streams series webinars are available on our YouTube channel and through the SIME website, as this one will be. So we're recording today, and this one will go live as well. So today we're talking about the Nature Recovery Green Paper and the Environmental Targets consultation. So both published by Defra for England, currently under consultation. The Green Paper closes the 11th of May, and at the moment the Environmental Targets consultation also says the 11th of May, but we understand that that's going to close later because there's some evidence packs coming, but we haven't seen them as yet. So we have a great panel today, Ben Kite and Alina Congreve. I'm going to ask them if they can introduce themselves before we make a start. Alina, can we start with you, please?
Yes, thanks for the invitation to come and talk about this important new set of documents and announcements that have come out. My name is Dr. Alina Congreve. I work on sort of planning and housing and related issues, and I do some training for SIME. So one of the bits of work I'm doing at the moment is the law and policy course for SIME members and the new early career programme.
That's great, thanks very much. And Ben?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Kite. I'm Managing Director of a consultancy called Ecological Planning and Research. We do all sorts of work really for developers and for regulators and for local authorities. But additionally, I'm also the chair of SIME's Strategic Policy Panel.
That's great. Thanks very much. So we will jump into some discussion now. If you have any questions, please do put those in the Q&A function, and we will come to those probably at the end. We'll see how far we get. I realise there's quite a lot for us to cover in an hour with the Green Paper and the environmental targets, so we'll see how we go. We'll try to get through things. So if we kick off, let's have a look at the Green Paper first. And thinking about sites, are site designations too complicated at the moment? Do they need reform? Ben?
I would say they could be usefully simplified in terms of it's not immediately obvious to lay people which is more important and where they sit in the hierarchy in terms of SSIs, SACs, SPAs, etc. But I think my view is that isn't the problem. The reason why only a very low proportion of SSIs are in favourable condition, which is supposedly the driver for these changes, if you read the Green Paper, is I think because we haven't adequately been enforcing the existing protections and investing in the recovery of designated sites. I don't think the tiering system and the labelling system has got anything to do with the problems that have been experienced with designated sites. So I think there's a bit of misdirection going on there.
And I very much agree with Ben. I don't think that their conditions would improve by giving them a different name. So calling them something else wouldn't materially improve the conservation status of the sites or the species that are using them. I mean, perhaps there is a case for calling them something more appealing. So SSSI, National Site Network, it isn't something that connects much with the public. So perhaps some more public-facing names for these really, really important sites could be beneficial. But it doesn't get to the core of the problem, which, as Ben, you were alluding to, is around implementation and then the budgets around implementation, not specifically around what we call them.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I mean, recently, all sorts of information's come out about how infrequently some SSIs are monitored, and problems with matching things like countryside stewardship, higher tier interventions to getting to the nub of the problem as to actually why these sites are in bad condition, and solving those is the issue, I think, not relabeling sites.
And for most conservation professionals and people working in planning, we have become familiar with these names. So I don't think amongst people who actually need to know what these names are, there's a lot of confusion there. And you could potentially generate a period of uncertainty and confusion if you went through a whole renaming and relabeling process.
And just on the point of, so this could be a relabeling process, but is the site's extent complete as it is anyway?
My view is no. I mean, SSIs were always meant to be representative of certain environmental assets, for want of a better way of describing them. So you have the best asset grasslands collected together, and representative sites picked and elevated to the level of SSI, which has meant that priority habitats outside of those designated sites that aren't quite good enough to be considered the cream of the cream have not been protected, and they've been lost, and that's part of what's been behind the significant loss of grasslands, for example, across the country. So yeah, no, I do definitely think there's scope for expanding what's covered by some of these designations, for sure.
Yeah, which isn't particularly covered in the paper. Yeah.
No.
Okay. Thanks. We've already talked about this being potentially a relabeling process. Do we have any thoughts on the options that are put forward around these relabeling, or the three options that were?
Well, my view is I think we need to be very careful with some of these, because there isn't actually a lot of detail with the options that the government's put forward, and there does appear to be a little bit of sleight of hand perhaps going on with some of the options. So if you look at option 1, for example, it opens with a very tempting offer, which is to pick the best SACs and SPAs and elevate them to this highly protected tier where they'll get more protection than they do currently. But then as you read on, the implication of that is that all the SACs and SPAs that don't quite get into that highly protected category would then be lumped in with nationally protected sites, SSIs, under the protected category. Now, whether or not that means they're going down in protection or not depends on the rules that are written for the protected sites category, about which there's no detail provided really in the paper at all. But it is at least possible that if those rules aren't right, then all the sites that are currently international levels of designation that get lumped into this protected sites category with SSIs may, in fact, the boundaries, well, the tiering between the two may end up getting blurred, and the practical reality of that might be that protected sites end up with less, well, international sites will end up with less protection if they don't make it into that top category. So that's something that I think we're going to have to engage quite fully on with the government to make sure that there's no backsliding as far as international sites protection is concerned.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, Ben. There is this sort of vague sort of carrot they're dangling, isn't there, of things getting even a higher level of protection. I wonder what you thought about the third one, the sort of tiered one. I mean, that seems sort of recipe for confusion for me, but perhaps I'm misreading that. I couldn't quite make that one out, and what that third tier of a sliding scale would involve.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's enough detail there to really pass judgment on it, is there? It's effectively saying, as I read it, it's effectively saying that it would the different treatment would be very bespoke from site to site, and it would depend on the rules that were written for it, and none of which is really explained in the consultation paper. So it's setting out a very broad strategic option, but it's not really providing any padding in terms of how it might work in practice. So I mean, certainly in terms of how we engage with the consultation, I think it's about saying, well, any of those options could work, but whether or not they work depends on the fine print that you've not given us yet. So we need to perhaps be spelling out to the government in our consultation responses what we think the fine print should be.
And I guess there's sort of a minimum that things are not worse than they are at the moment. So an absolute bottom line would be that sites don't have less protection than they do currently. Which was one of those. I mean, that was a flagship thing that came out of the Brexit stuff, and as departing from the European Union, that that nothing would be worse after we left. And until you see the fine print, it's quite hard to tell with some of these options.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the paper that we're going to come on to later, the environmental targets paper, it sets an aspiration for halting biodiversity loss by a particular point in time, and given that the trend is currently negative, any kind of backsliding would be completely inconsistent with achieving that goal.
Yeah, thanks. I would be very cautious around option 3. I think having one label and then every individual case being a case-by-case management plan is dangerous.
It seems the opposite of simplification, streamlining as well. And given that we'll come to this later, but given the resourcing that's available in local authorities around ecological expertise, that makes option 3 seem quite intensive in terms of the staffing it would require to actually make that option function effectively.
I think that's certainly right, and with Natural England too, if writing the sort of site level documentation as to what's important on that site and therefore what protections are needed to protect those qualifying features. There'll be huge variation between different area teams and different members of staff in different parts of the country, I think, because you'd have to come up with a system of rules very rapidly and then roll it out across the entire country through people that have different ideas as to how it should be implemented. So I think unless there was a very long lead-in time to get that right, it would just make things worse and complicated and messy.
Okay, if we move on a little bit, how do we see potential options, either as they change or potentially now fitting with other schemes like biodiversity net gain, ELMS, local nature recovery strategies? Is that still a concern?
So if I jump in on this one to start with, I've been doing some work recently on the new district level licensing scheme, and one of the interesting things talking to stakeholders as part of that process has been the interrelationship. So how all these different things, the biodiversity net gain, the ELMS, the sites coming forward for other mitigation things like district licensing, how that all pieces together, so how that becomes part of a coherent whole. And it seems like there's still quite a lot of work to do, both within Natural England about different Natural England schemes, like how biodiversity net gain aligns with other things, but also how biodiversity net gain aligns with ELMS. And that, I mean, there is, I guess, a risk here that you end up, say, with a site and you segment that site into different pieces. So you have the district level licensing ponds over there, the net gain bit over there, the mitigation from the big road scheme over here. So you literally divide a site up into 4 or 5 blocks, and you do each activity in each block, which is entirely, I guess, contrary to having some kind of integrated whole site system of management. But the funding might end up pushing activity down that route rather than some kind of positive alignment where you have, I don't know, terrestrial habitat for newts paid for by net gain around a DLL pond paid through by district level licensing. So while there is a lot of potential positive alignment, there needs to be a lot of thought about the mechanics of the schemes to make sure that that is realised.
Just before I bring Ben in, what are your thoughts, Lena, on, sorry, this might be putting you on the spot slightly, around stacking those benefits rather than segmenting a site potentially?
What do you mean stacking?
So if you have biodiversity net gain and, say, carbon credits and district level licensing all on the same site, rather than being bits of a different site all layered on top of one another.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's obviously rightly a lot of concern about double counting, so that you don't get a particular stakeholder paid twice for doing exactly the same thing. So there needs to be additionality in it. So you need to make sure that if money is coming in from several different sources, you are, you're getting bang for your buck for each one, that you are actually getting, they're not, someone isn't being paid 3 times for exactly one pond. Yeah. So obviously you need to be careful about that. But in being careful about that, you could end up being so careful that you end up with these sites that are highly fragmentary. And part of the point of bringing those things together might be to get some scale, so that you have larger habitats that are bigger and better and more joined up, rather than isolated ponds in the corners of fields or little strips of net gain habitat somewhere. So I think there is the potential for scale and for reducing administration costs by as you say, by stacking.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Ben.
I would agree with that. I think one of the things that got lost slightly with the principle of additionality is for me, the root and most important thing to establish is which project is responsible for delivering that benefit. Because if a particular project delivers that benefit, that, for example, if it's a biodiversity net gain intervention, then that project does need to get credit for that. It does need to get the benefit and the credit for that intervention. Otherwise, what you're doing is penalising a project just because it happened to be good, even if that goodness was for other reasons. Really, what we want to do is get to a situation where the better an individual project is, the more credit it gets, and the more likely it is to happen. I think I agree with Alina. Really, I think we're coming at it from a similar perspective, isn't it? Additionality is a good thing, but you need to be able to tell the difference between stacking of benefits, where they're each separate interventions, even if they're delivered by the same project, and double counting, which is when it's really only one intervention, but you're being paid for it multiple times. But this is actually one area where there might be some positivity in the government's general approach, is that it is at the moment a problem that if a site is in a biodiversity opportunity area, or it's been worked on to improve its biodiversity, if that isn't secured somehow through some kind of legal agreement that runs with either with the owner or the land, and then it doesn't really have that thing that in theory should be improving, doesn't really have any protection. So if the new sites protection system recognised sites that had been effectively set aside for ecological improvement and offered them some kind of permanence, then that would be a positive step, I think.
And also just some way of recognising them and making sure that someone doesn't accidentally come along and do something. So one of the local authorities I interviewed recently, they've got a layer on their GIS system called MITI, which is all the mitigation measures that have gone in, whether that was large road schemes or tree planting schemes, or other kind of ecological mitigation. So when someone was planning some other kind of intervention, they weren't going to accidentally traipse across this area that had been funded for ecological mitigation. But that was certainly an exception. So there is more to do there in recognising the importance of these mitigation measures in planning and land use to make sure we sustain those things going forward. So I agree that we talked earlier about confusion around designations. I think the one thing I would prioritise sorting out is around the labelling and the recognition of these habitats we're creating through mitigation measures.
I'd completely agree with that. I mean, even as a practitioner working on an individual long-running project, some of my projects have been going on for more than a decade, and remembering what you did a decade ago to mitigate a particular impact. That's, even within a project, it can be difficult to remember why that thing was done there, and things do get lost over time. So recording and tracking and recognising it and is definitely a positive. Generally, it would be a positive step at every scale, I think.
Thanks very much. Let's move on. Time is ticking. We've got 2 additional papers on the habitats regulations, a little bit in the paper, the green paper itself. I'm interested in your thoughts on the thinking, the sort of background to those, the rationale for change, and then the little bit of information that we have got on what they might change.
I was really deflated by the HRA side of the paper. I have to admit, the support paper that came with the Nature Recovery Green paper, the HRA subject paper, was almost illiterate, I think, as far as HRA was concerned. They claim to have consulted HRA experts in pulling it together, but they don't name them. It prays in aid a quote from Lord Justice Sullivan in the Dilly Lane case, which is actually a case that my company was involved in, but it misdeploys the quote. He was actually criticising people for interpreting the habitats regulations and directive in a way that was over precautionary, and saying it's meant to be, look at this, it's not meant to be a legal obstacle course, it's meant to be an aid to effective environmental decision making. It should be interpreted pragmatically. So he was saying that the error lay with those doing the interpreting, not with the legislation. But that quote has been used to criticise the legislation. I actually do believe it's been problems with interpretation, and as we use HRA more and more, actually that's got better through practice, not worse. And I think practitioners are much more aware of what they need to do when projects are passing through the habitats regulations. But just in terms of other general points, it's slightly concerning that, for example, there's a renewed emphasis on compensation which implies that damage to international sites might be more acceptable more often if you're making more room for compensation to be an acceptable route to go down. There's more emphasis on allowing flexibility for individual case officers to use their scientific judgment, which again is worrying given that only a third of local authorities, we're told, have an in-house ecologist. Whose scientific judgment are we talking about if they don't employ an ecologist? And the other thing that worries me slightly is there's a suggestion that the Secretary of State will now be given the final say on whether or not sites are actually designated in the first place. And I do believe that there needs to be a democratic mandate for the rules that apply to designated sites, because they affect society, and therefore there needs to be a democratic acceptance that impacts on society are actually wanted by society, that they're democratically mandated. But whether or not a site reaches a particular designation criteria, I think, is a scientific judgment, and bringing in a political element to that judgment, I think, it's a worrying new dimension to the way we would do things. I think it needs to be as pure a scientific judgment as possible. This is the criteria, does it meet it or not? The rules that then apply are a matter for discussion and debate, but the actual scientific criteria, I think, is something that needs to be kept out of politics as much as possible, I think.
I completely agree with Ben and his evaluation there. I suppose I'll pick up on your point about the precautionary principle, that this seems to be something that in the sort of wider political debate is something that politicians seem to be misunderstanding or even willfully misunderstanding at the moment. And that within the precautionary principle, it's what you're being precautionary about. And if you think that a protected species is going to be obliterated by something, then yes, you take a precautionary approach. If you think there's going to be a minor impact on a small part of the site that might affect one species that isn't protected, then there's a whole thing around proportionality in response to it. So I think they misdeploying and misinterpreting how they're using the precautionary principle, which is something we're seeing more widely across environmental policy making, whether that's on chemicals or waste or other policy areas. That the precautionary principle is being presented as the thing that stops us doing anything when it isn't. It's a fundamental underpinning of how we approach environmental problems when we have incomplete knowledge.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the case law is quite clear. It sort of says that you shouldn't aim for zero risk because that's mathematically impossible. There is an infinitesimally small chance that the sun might not rise tomorrow. So aiming for zero risk is completely the wrong approach. If you go back to the Commission's original guidance, they're quite clear that the principle of precautionality applies in tandem with the principle of proportionality, which is exactly as you said. If the consequences of being wrong are minor, then you can afford to take more risks than if the consequences of being wrong mean the destruction of a designated site. If that's a possibility, then you don't do it. You err on the side of caution. But if being wrong actually wouldn't mean that much, then you can be a bit more risk. You can afford to take more risks.
And I mean, as a general principle, I really support the idea of using local knowledge and local expertise and drawing on that. But as you were saying, if there isn't local expertise there, then pushing, really sort of important scientific decisions down to effectively planning teams where there isn't that kind of ecological knowledge does create a significant, I guess, additional risk that's around the judgments that people are making without the level of technical knowledge to help inform those decisions.
Great, thank you. If we move on to the 30 by 30 proposals, what do we think of the approach that's laid out in the paper to achieve that? I mean, I think it's really great that they're discounting landscape designations, but we are moving down the route where they could potentially contribute if they're amended in some or other way.
Yeah, I mean, broadly, I think that's not too bad an approach, really. I mean, we all know that national parks is the example that's often cited, is that because they're fulfilling a multifunctional role, quite often they're not managed in the way that they could or should be for delivering biodiversity benefits. So unless that were to change, then fair enough, they shouldn't count towards those targets. And in general, there's been criticism, particularly I think in the marine fora, about marine protected areas just being paper parks, actually, so that they're designated to great fanfare, so that they can be held aloft as an achievement. But then once they're designated, are the rules inside the protected area actually much different to what happens outside the protected area, and are they monitored and are they enforced? At the end of the day, if you can do bottom trawling and all sorts of damaging activities inside the protected area, it's just an arbitrary line on a map. It's not actually it's not fulfilling its roles. So any sites need to be making a meaningful contribution before they're counted towards those targets, I think.
I'd agree. I mean, also with your points on the marine stuff, as well as the activities that you're allowed to do inside marine protected areas, which aren't actually that different to those you're allowed to do outside them. There's also, I guess, in marine areas, the additional movement of species within them that isn't taken into account. So even more than terrestrial environments, the mobility of a lot of the species we're concerned about. Well, I suppose there's a sort of an overarching thing with the 30 by 30. I think it is important that we are committed to this. I think when the UK is taking part in international discussions around biodiversity, it's important that we're seen as being behind these high-level targets and the credibility that then gives us when we're going to international negotiations. So, I think it's generally a positive thing that we're embracing that, although as professional ecologists we have a lot of concern about implementation. It is like a big picture thing that we need to be getting behind with the international stuff around the Convention for Biological Diversity.
Yeah, I think it's great that we were part of the Leaders Pledge for Nature. It's just meaningful implementation now. Yeah, we've discussed a little bit about the marine elements of it. Was there anything else on that? I mean, there's only a very small section on it. Is there anything else you wanted to cover on the marine elements?
I don't think so, not specifically from my perspective. I mean, there's not an awful lot of detail in the paper, and to be honest, I'm not a marine specialist anyway. So, and
if there are any marine specialists there in the chat, do put something in. We're both rather firmly on the ground, so if there's any marine expertise out there, do put your comments in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, on the consultation, we'd be grateful for any marine input to the consultation as well. We do have a marine special interest group, and we'll be asking for their input. But yeah, any marine input would be gratefully received at our end as well. Let's move on to species. It's laid out in the paper that licensing is overly complex, inconsistent, outdated. Is that necessarily true?
I'm not sure what to say about this because district level licensing has rather taken over my life recently. So I feel I could just talk for hours about district level. I mean, I think there are things around the rules around it, but I think there are also important things around the resourcing of it as well and the staffing levels that go into it. So you could make up a whole different set of rules around licensing, but if there isn't the resourcing there to support that, whatever other mechanism you have won't work either. So there are important things around Natural England being sufficiently staffed to be able to resource whatever kind of licensing schemes put into place. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why some organisations are very positive about district level licensing, because they can pick up the phone and talk to a person and they find that a really valuable thing, that you can have a conversation with the person and you can find the best way forward for that species and that site. So I think some of it is obviously around the rules and how it works, but some of it is also around those professional relationships we have with individuals and getting where you can just sort of have that sort of chat with someone and find the best way forward for your particular project or your particular site. And I think some of the positivity around DLL with quite a few stakeholders is that way in which the resourcing and the professional side of it at Natural England has been supported.
I think I very much agree with that. I mean, there is definitely room for improvement with the protected species system and with licensing. And I think for some sort of low impact type scenarios, there's definitely too much of a sort of bureaucratic hurdle for everyone to get through, and a lot of benefits in changing that so that you can focus actually more regulatory attention on the particular projects that need it, that are likely to do the most harm. But we've got to be very careful here that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, in my view, because part of it is a resourcing problem, actually, that it would all work a bit better if Natural England were better resourced. And Natural England has already taken some fairly major steps to simplify things with things like district level licensing and earned recognition and those sorts of initiatives. Whether or not we need to completely throw out the system and relabel it, I'm doubtful of. And dangerous things can happen if we're not careful. I mean, I was a little bit concerned recently with the review of the schedules on the Wildlife and Countryside Act, that at least with the original proposals, although they do seem to be being sort of iteratively improved as consultation progresses. But certainly
do you mean the quinquennial review, Ben? Is that what?
Yeah, the quinquennial review. So
yeah.
Something that horrified me at the beginning was that the original proposals were that protection was would solely apply to things that were already endangered or critically endangered. Now, I think the thing that's being completely lost and missed there is that if something's at that end of the scale, it's already in serious trouble. And part of the point of protection and its usefulness is stopping things from ending up there. So a species like the adder, for example, that suffer from persecution and are already locked into what seems to be a significant decline, if you suddenly remove the protection from that species, then they'll end up endangered and critically endangered. And that whole element of protection was completely overlooked in the original proposal.
Or equally conservation success stories. I mean, things like red kites that have been going really well. I mean, do we remove protection from them because they're a conservation success story and then see them go back into being persecuted and experiencing difficulties? So yes, there was certainly some significant issues around the way in which species were being recategorized as part of that process.
Yeah, there needs to be much more attention paid to protection dependency, I think.
Just sort of going back a bit, we're talking earlier about alignment and misalignment with things. I mean, I think there's also the potential for sort of misalignment with some of the sort of compensatory habitats that are created. So on one project I'm aware of, the developer went into district level licensing for newts, but then kept ponds on site and did them for newts as part of biodiversity net gain, and that to me is absolutely nonsensical that you would do that. But you can end up with various different initiatives leading to that kind of misalignment between both things coming out from Natural England, not even the stuff that ties into Defra.
Okay, thank you. What do you think about the tiered approach? These 1, 2, and 3. Changing things up a bit.
Much the same as with the tiering of designated sites, I think. I mean, at the moment, there is room for simplification because because the system's been built up from different directions. Species that are protected under the Habitats Regulations and the Wildlife and Countryside Act, and there are similar terms used to protect. Different terms used to protect similar things, such as whether it's a place for shelter or rest or a place for breeding or what have you. There's definitely scope for simplifying that within the tiered system. But as with the proposals for designated sites, the devil will be in the detail, and we've got to be careful that the right protection applies at the right tiers and the right things are assigned to the right tiers, and that's what will make the difference. Simply changing the names of things. It might make it easier for the general public to understand, which is a good thing. But what we really wanted to do is achieve the conservation outcomes that we want to see, and that will depend on how the rules are actually applied, not the broad principle of tiering. And there's not a lot of detail about that again in the paper.
And as with the protected sites, we wouldn't want things to have less protection than they do at the moment. So as a bottom line, nothing should be less protected than it is now, because even those that have favourable conservation status, that's often because of ecological success stories. Indeed. So we wouldn't want them to start backsliding. Yeah. So that should be, I guess, a sort of bottom line to it, that things aren't in a worse position at the end of this than they are at the moment. And also sort of around local extinctions as well, that we should perhaps have some sort of regard to that. And a lot of work went in over a number of years into sort of local biodiversity action plans, things become extinct from parts of the country. And that's something that might end up not being captured by the approach that's being set out there. But if you're just taking a national picture, but you're willing to accept species becoming extinct across significant parts of their ranges.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're maybe coming on to a bit later when we get onto the environmental targets paper, but that was actually one of the things that I did like about in that second paper was that, the idea that there would be a sort of more regionalisation in the red list. So rather than a sort of unified GB red list, you can have one for England, Wales, Scotland, and then perhaps even break that down further to the regions of the UK, so that you don't end up with a contraction in the range of species, that they continue to occupy the full amount of space that they do. You don't sleepwalk into a situation where you've lost them in one part of the country completely, and therefore they become more vulnerable in their strongholds.
And losing that genetic diversity as well, that if you're losing them across quite a part of their range, and of course with climate change as well, that they might actually need that part of their range in future.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Moving on to public body reform, we've spoken a bit about Natural England resourcing. Is now the right time to be talking about public body reform?
I say no. I mean, I guess it's, that we're experts in ecology, but there are other people out there who are experts in management and organisations and systems. And there will always be a lot of disruption when you make major changes to organisations, that it will take them a while to get back to kind of an optimum way of working again. It's very disruptive, throwing everyone's job up in the end. Even if the process is managed really, really well, that's still going to be a disruptive time when all of the organisations will, I guess, be distracted by that internal reorganisation process and not be focused on outcomes and implementation. So I think there's a real risk that for quite a long period, even if it's managed well, that these organisations will be tied up with that process. And if it's managed badly, then there's the potential risk of losing expertise. So staff become very frustrated with not doing their job, but being tied up with this internal reorganisational process and the erosion of expert staff from those organisations, which we so badly need to be built up over a period of time.
I would agree with that. I think in the time I've been practicing as an ecologist, it seems that the furniture is always being rearranged. There's never a time when there isn't some kind of structural reorganisation going on in one of the regulators. You barely get to the point where you get to know your local Natural England area team before all the borders and boundaries are being reorganised. And I think a lot of that is hampering their ability to focus their resources on getting the job done. So broadly, I agree. I think we need to let the regulators get on with their job and stop moving the goalposts. There is, I think, a case for some kind of collaborative body, perhaps comprised of a range of regulators, because the Environment Act hands new responsibilities to local authorities for writing local nature recovery strategies and implementing biodiversity net gain register sites and what have you. And I think the problem at the moment is that since the regional planning assemblies were abolished, there is an absence of strategic landscape scale thought beyond district and borough boundaries, basically. If we want local nature recovery strategies to work, we need to be thinking about, for example, with chalk grassland, probably the whole of the south of England, along the south coast, and we need to be thinking about the whole of the Thames Basin if it's heathland restoration. So it needs multiple local authorities. And my experience of local nature partnerships is that they're comprised of many nature conservation bodies, all with slightly different priorities. What the RSPB might be trying to bring about benefits for birds, plant life for rare plants, and so everybody's got their own ideas. And at the moment, if you just draw a boundary around a district, I don't think a coherent plan is going to fall out of that unless it has some leadership, and it's not going to have the value that it could have if one district was joined up to another district that had similar habitats in another district. So I think there is a case for bringing groups together in some kind of forum that operates on a regional scale, so there's a bit more joined up thinking across borders. And to a certain extent that's happening already, because in Dorset, for example, local planning authorities have become unitary, and then they've started stitching themselves together in bigger and bigger groups that almost look like counties again. And I think that's a recognition of the absence of that wider scale strategic thinking and trying to join things up again. So I think probably a role for some kind of collaborative forum, but not a reorganisation of the regulators and the
I
public.
mean, could the areas that the Environment Agency has for its catchments, would that make sense as some kind of strategic scale? Some of this work?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think that's kind of an organically grown solution to the problem that we're all describing. That is that, you know, in order to solve a problem for a river, for example, you need to bring on board the agricultural sector because they're polluting the river upstream. You need to bring on board the water companies because they're dealing with sewage. You need to bring on board, you know, the people that deal with fish and fisheries and even the marine environment because the river discharges into the sea. So we can only solve these really chewy environmental problems if we're thinking at that landscape scale. And for me, that's what the current system struggles to deal with. Because everything is based around artificial boundaries, around local plans, districts and boroughs, and looking inwards. And there needs to be that outward looking, or at least cross connection function on units of geography and space that make more sense in environmental terms.
And just while we're on water, I mean, that is an area where Natural England and the Environment Agency do trip over each other quite a bit. And I don't think you need to combine them into one massively huge regulator to get over that. But you might try and look at ways in which you could align their work. So they're positively aligning rather than having gaps and then tripping over each other. But that's you don't need to create one single huge regulator to address that particular issue.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's an extension of the duty to cooperate, really, because I mean, at present, public bodies are required to cooperate with local authorities to achieve the strategic objectives of a local plan. Really, what we want to do is extend that so it's looking beyond one local plan, actually, to multiple local plans and sort of regional level objectives, and rope in more bodies than just the sort of core public bodies that are currently subject to the duty. So they're data sharing, they're knowledge sharing, they're talking about strategic objectives and all rowing in the same direction. So I suppose I'm talking about a talking shop, really, which is not a popular thing to propose. But there needs to be some kind of
you're reinventing
forum.
Regional planning, effectively, aren't you?
Well, I suppose I am in a way, yeah. But there's a leadership gap there. You've got the NPPF at the top, where the environment 25-year environment plan and this sort of thing, which set up these high targets, and then you've got big gap, and then at the bottom you've got all the delivery, all the people on the ground trying to deliver it in 1,000 different ways. It needs something in the middle.
And as you say, there have been some of these sort of voluntary partnerships where people have created something in the middle, haven't they, to try and address that. So
yeah.
We're going to have to move on, I'm afraid. That's all right. It's interesting. Last thing on the green paper, just there's a section at the end around financing, and I'm just interested in your thoughts on, there's reference there to private fund financing and accessing private finance and scaling that over time. There isn't any talk of public funding. I'm curious of your thoughts on that.
Well, you've definitely picked out a gap. I mean, I think public funding is going to be necessary to get a lot of these initiatives started. I mean, private money is going to be important, and anything that we can do to encourage private money to go into nature conservation projects, green bonds, or whatever they're called, however they're labelled, it could potentially make a massive difference if in the way that, I mean, there's a carbon market that's been created and is becoming very hot and active, and although there's a lot of greenwashing that goes on within that market, it has generated a lot of capital that has funded a lot of good projects, and if we can do the same for biodiversity, I think that would be great. But private money will only go into that kind of, whether it's habitat banking or whatever it is, private money will only go into it if they can see that it's not going to be lost, it's not being thrown away. There's going to be a return on the investment, and sometimes that means seed funding with public money, and an expectation that that the public might get its money, the public purse might get its money back at the end of the process as well. But something needs to get the ball rolling, and I think public money is the most obvious way to do that.
I mean, there's public money as well in terms of making sure the regulators are funded effectively to get to their jobs. So the bit we talked about earlier about the performance of SSIs, a lot of that lack of performance rests on the funding Natural England received to be able to fulfil that regulatory function. So there's a big question around both the Environment Agency and Natural England and the level of public funding they have to be able to fulfil their statutory functions. I think also in terms of public money, I mean, going back to sort of, bigger picture in the biodiversity COP, there's been quite a lot of stuff in the biodiversity COP and that process around eliminating perverse subsidies. So rather than putting a bit of extra money into conservation, to look structurally at where public money is going in to things that actually damage biodiversity. So rather than giving a little bit more money to biodiversity, to look at all those other government funding streams, whether that's through economic development or transport or farming, and the alignment of those schemes to things that actively damage biodiversity. So I think that's one of the sort of big picture debates coming out of the biodiversity COP process, but one where I think our attention could lie as well.
I completely agree, and also another aspect to that is taxation, because trying to get estates and landowners to make their land available for biodiversity net gain projects, a lot of them are very interested and would love to do it, but if it's currently agricultural land that they own, then they benefit from inheritance tax relief, which means that they can pass the estate on to their children when they're finished farming it. And if the land can no longer be called agricultural because it's been turned into a nature reserve and it doesn't fulfil an agricultural function, there is a lot of concern, certainly amongst landowners that I've been working with, that means that they will lose their estate and they can't pass it on to their children, which means that they think, well, I'd love to do it, but I'm not willing for my kids' inheritance to be taken from me in order for it to happen. So I do think there needs to be a look at taxation so that it is that engaging money and assets, whether that's land or other assets, in the general good fight for biodiversity, it's not penalised. It's positive in taxation terms. Somebody's not going to be penalised for being good.
Absolutely, and I don't think that's something there's a lot of recognition of out there, that's currently a barrier. And also perhaps how you might have several things go on the same piece of land. So as well as biodiversity benefits, you might have renewable energy generation or growing renewable energy crops in the same sort of wider areas. There is the potential there for alignment around things that are good for climate change and also good for biodiversity as well.
Thanks very much. Let's move on to the environmental targets paper. Just a reminder to everyone who's on the call, on the webinar, rather, sorry, just to put any questions you might have into the Q&A function, and we will come to those. But moving on to the environmental targets, let's have a look at the biodiversity elements first. And they've got 3 things in there. Well, we could add in the woodland cover as well, actually. But species abundance, 10% by 2042. Is that ambitious? Is it right? Is it going to work? Is just abundance on its own going to help? I mean, you mentioned distribution earlier, Alina.
I suppose I'm somewhat underwhelmed by this. And I suppose I compare it very much to the kind of targets that happen in climate change, where the Committee on Climate Change sets a carbon budget. There's very close monitoring of that carbon budget. It's about getting us to net zero by 2050, but there are sort of, I guess, clear steps along the way. The targets are informed by science, and there are sort of interim targets. So don't just wait until 2042 and then say, oh gosh, we haven't really got anywhere, have we? There's lots of interim stages that you get to up until that point. So I suppose I compare this quite negatively, really, to the kind of rigor that's going into the target setting around climate change and the interim steps and the monitoring and the science base behind it.
There's certainly an element of cart before horse, isn't there? Because it's the 10% target seems to be a little bit plucked out of the air rather than informed by a detailed analysis of what's possible.
Why do we need 10%? Where is this from?
Yeah, absolutely, and what's achievable. But so yeah, and given that the whole purpose of a green paper is for the government to be able to be a little bit outrageous and propose things that are innovative or a little bit wild, and just see whether or not they land, and what reception they get. You'd think that they'd be a bit braver with what they put in both of these papers, actually, but Another thing that worries me with the species abundance target is how it's going to be measured, because they seem to be proposing picking a suite of 1,000 species and using those to monitor as a proxy measure for whether or not species abundance is going down or improving. But there's, again, the devil will be in the detail there, because what you could have is very serious declines in some of that assemblage, some of those 1,000 species, priority species, for example, being masked by great gains in abundance of other species, if you're only looking at an average across the 1,000 species. So you almost need to break it down and look at perhaps an average across the 1,000 species, but then pick out priority species and require a 10% uplift in those on top of that, separately, and probably a couple of other sub-measures as well, because otherwise I do worry that, cause how you pick the 1,000 species as well will be crucially important, so that they're an adequate, a broad suite of indicators for all terrestrial habitats and taxa.
And it could end up with that we pick species that we have reasonably good data on, rather than species that are particularly informing us about the state of ecosystems, or that are keystone species and that deliver important ecosystem functions. So, like, really pragmatically, we could just pick 1,000 species that we've got the best data on and read to measure, rather than ones that are really telling us about the health of our natural environment.
Yeah.
So on that, let's move on to the red list species then. That's also something that might be swayed by data and what we might have. What do we think of that as a process, as an approach, with using the red list species, index?
I mean, I think it needs to be part of it. And as I said earlier, I do like the idea of breaking down the red list to create red lists for smaller geographic areas. So the countries within the UK, and then ideally the regions as well, at least, so that we can monitor the retreat of biodiversity geographically and spatially, as well as in terms of numbers of individuals, because that's just as important. So I think that's a step in the right direction. It's only a small step, but it is a step in the right direction, bringing those in. Again, there are dangers in relying too heavily on the red lists, because they're not designed to be directly translated into policy. They're simply meant to flag up species that are in trouble, so that policy action can then be taken specifically in relation to those species. So it is turning it on its head a bit. But it, yeah, I mean, broadly, I quite like the idea, as I said, of using it as one of the tools in the box.
Alina, anything to add to that? No. Okay, let's move on to the 500,000 hectares of restored habitat. A bit of a silly question, is that going to be enough? It doesn't fit with 30 by 30, does it?
No, I guess also that there's a disconnect here, isn't there, with wider environmental policy as well, in that I guess part of what we're restoring things for is around climate change. So both allowing species to migrate as climate changes, but also protecting ourselves and our built environment from increasingly extreme climatic conditions, and providing some resilience around climate change. So I guess I see a bit of a disconnect here between these rather arbitrary figures around restoration and the function that you want that restored land to do around the adaptation and mitigation to climate change. So that figure again doesn't seem to have, I can't quite see where that's come from. That's partly perhaps tied into this section, that some of the scientific evidence that's underpinning it that still hasn't been published.
Yeah.
It's definitely not a big enough number, 500,000 hectares. But the other thing about it is, what does restored mean exactly, and when do you decide that a habitat has been restored? Because there's many possible different answers to that question, and some of them, what we want to avoid is a situation where land is counted as restored just because an agreement has been reached that something's going to be done. Actually, what we need to be recording is when that thing is actually then done and it is successful in achieving what it was meant to achieve. We need to be counting land as restored at the end of that process. I mean, those of us that have been doing this a little bit longer will remember back, I think, in 2008, when it suited the government of the day for the SSSI system to be seen to be doing its job, and all of a sudden there was a sort of a big uptick in the amount of land that was being reported through common standards monitoring as reaching either favourable or recovering, what they called target condition at the time. I think it got up to about 84% at one point in time, and then more recently, when it's not suited this government for SSIs to be doing their job, the figure is reported that only 34% of land is in SSIs is in favourable condition. So I'm a bit worried about how malleable that figure has become, and when things are counted as restored or not restored, and so I think we need to be clear about that before we
and what's the funding, what's the mechanism that keeps this land restored, and how do we record it as being restored so we don't build something on top of it in a few years' time? What's the status of this restored land?
So there's a concern with longevity here as well. They mentioned biodiversity net gain, elms, nature for climate funds, biodiversity net gain is a 30-year time horizon. Elms, could be variable, but that's not in perpetuity at all. So yeah, there is potential for how long this will last. Okay, thank you. Let's move on to this. We've already established we're not marine experts, but there are some targets for the sea. I'm curious as to what you think about the targets, and also, I mean, there's a 150 species that they're suggesting here as a proxy for measuring it, which is a lot less than they're using before. I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
I guess some of our comments about sort of monitoring would come through even more so with marine species. So while we've got issues about monitoring on land, those are amplified even more so in the marine environment, and our very, very incomplete knowledge of marine ecosystems, even compared to our patchy knowledge of many terrestrial settings.
Let's jump ahead slightly in the paper quickly. Let's go to the woodland cover, because I feel that's the biodiversity element of it, and we can come back to the others if we have some time. There's a target to increase woodland cover across the UK from the current 14.5% to 17.5%, which I think comes from the 25-year environment plan. It sounds great. Do you have any thoughts?
I like the recent refinement in the woodland cover message, because the old mantra of more trees, more good, I think has been a victim of its own success, in that we've ended up seeing very biodiversity poor artificial woodlands springing up all over the place, quite often, well, not quite often, but sometimes eradicating habitats that are ancient and species rich, and sometimes that are even sequester more carbon than the woods that are created. So there have been some horrendous examples of projects up north where millennia-old peat bogs have been drained to put up an artificial plantation, supposedly for carbon sequestration purposes, and that will achieve neither. Not only have you destroyed an irreplaceable biodiversity asset, but you've also released all the carbon in the peat. I think the recent refinement in the message that it's the right trees in the right place is a step in the right direction, and we need to keep banging that drum, I think. And I'm not at all against the increase in woodland cover, but the increase in woodland cover, it needs to be the right kind of woodland in the right place. It mustn't be displacing open habitats of greater biodiversity value.
Which goes into sort of ecological expertise, and that the organisations involved in these projects need experienced ecologists on board to make sure that they have that ecological underpinning to make sure the right trees do go in the right place. And as you say, that there isn't sort of damage to peat bogs that does worse damage to climate change than any sort of tree planting scheme. And that is still perhaps an issue with some forestry and tree planting projects in the UK currently.
Okay, moving swiftly on. Was there anything you wanted to talk about around the water quality, resource efficiency, or air quality targets?
Only one observation really for water quality and air quality is that they've omitted the measures that really matter. For water quality, I think it's focused on phosphorus reduction, and I don't have any problem with that, because it's phosphorus pollution from agricultural runoff and wastewater and those sorts of sources that are causing the most damage to rivers. But they've omitted things like nitrogen, which are causing the most damage to marine environments, and they're easily measured. So why haven't we got a target for it? And I can only presume that it's going to be more expensive to actually drive reductions in nitrogen pollution, and therefore that's why it's not been touched. But it's the same with air quality. The only target that's been set is, I think, for PM 2.5, so small particulate matter that is a health hazard to human beings. And I've got no objection to that being included. But why haven't we covered oxides of nitrogen, which or ammonia or nitrogen deposition or sulfur dioxide or any of those pollutants that cause very severe damage? I mean, not deposition of nitrogen is the key one, actually. In excess of 70% of designated sites, I think, are currently over their critical loads for nitrogen deposition for at least one of their qualifying features. So damage is being done now, and we can measure that. It's already measured and modelled by APIS. You can go online and see the real-time monitoring data of what the pollution levels are. So you can record the reduction. So why don't we have a target for those things?
And I think there's also a concern about the water side of things, that we may not actually get improvements in the physical environment. So we're setting targets like sectors and things, but in terms of the actual going out and measuring to see if there has been intangible improvement, we may not actually end up with rivers being in an ecologically and chemically better state at the end of this process than they are now. So I think there are real questions about what we're targeting and what we're measuring, and that the actual rivers out there in the real world may not be in a better ecological state as a result of this change to how we manage the environment.
That's great. Thanks very much. So, well, we've had one comment in the questions rather than an actual question, so we'll park that for a moment. One last question to each of you is what are your thoughts on the ambition for both the green paper and the targets? And then are they deliverable? Can we actually deliver what ambition is in here with what we have at the moment? Ben, should we come to you first?
Well, I mean, I don't see any targets set out that we should struggle to meet if meaningful action is taken, and which I think answers the other part of the question about ambition. It's an underwhelming. The pair of them are underwhelming papers. I mean, in my view, they're not. The targets are not evidence based. Some of them are. They're not. Broadly, they're not sufficiently evidence based. And they're not ambitious enough. They won't require much of a stretch of government and the apparatus of government. So I think, yes, it's achievable, but we need to be reaching higher.
And I completely agree. I want to guess, going back to my earlier point about climate change, that we have really ambitious stretching targets around climate change. And if we're serious that there is an ecological and a biodiversity emergency as well as a climate emergency, then I think that the targets around biodiversity should be as taxing and as rigorously monitored and as the same kind of interim targets and being science-based as we have for climate change. So I suppose that's my reflection on it, that, well, we have this really leading ambition around being zero carbon. I don't see the same level of ambition here addressing the biodiversity crisis.
Brilliant. Thank you very much to both of you. So we'll draw the conversation to a close there. As I said, this has been recorded. It'll be added to our YouTube channel and to the resource hub on the SIME website. Thank you very much for everyone for attending. Thank you very much for Alina and Ben's thoughts, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.